The Credit Valley Railway was chartered in 1871. In 2021, this section of the line ceased operations as the Orangeville Brampton Railway. A lot happened in that century and a half. Let's explore. The couple of decades following Confederation saw a flurry of railroad construction activity in Ontario. I've mentioned a number of those railways in past videos on railroads or on rail trails. The Credit Valley Railroad was authorized to build a line from Toronto to Orangeville with some branch lines heading west. It was originally planned to be a narrow gauge railroad, but that plan was changed before construction began to be standard gauge. Gauge is the distance that the tracks are set apart. Standard gauge is 4 foot 8.5. Anything narrower than that is considered narrow gauge, and this line was originally planned to be 3 foot 6. Anything wider is called broad gauge, and that includes Toronto's subway and streetcar lines, as I covered in my video on Toronto gauge. There's a magic link up here, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you've finished watching this video. While some of the earliest lines in Canada were standard gauge, most lines constructed prior to about 1870 were broad gauge. We'll get to that in a sec.
Let's trace the railroad's development on a map. For the sake of simplicity, instead of trying to draw the exact path of the tracks, I've connected places with approximations. Sources differ on when various parts of the railroad opened, but they all agree that construction took quite a few years and wasn't always continuous due to financial difficulties. That was pretty common in those days, for at least a couple of reasons. There was a prolonged worldwide economic downturn around that time. In fact, while it's now known as the Long Depression, it was actually called the Great Depression until we recycled that name for the one that happened in the 1930s. Also, more locally, there were a lot of railroads being built, all of which desperately needed funding since building a railroad is capital intensive. Some of the same individuals were involved in multiple railroads. For instance, the promoter behind the Credit Valley Railway, George Laidlaw, was also involved in promoting several other railroads, one of which we'll get to shortly. There were government subsidies available to get railroads built, and this ties in with broad gauge. In 1851, the government of the Province of Canada, as the colony was called, adopted 5 foot 6 as the recommended gauge, and subsidies were only available for railroads using this gauge. In Canada, it came to be known as provincial gauge, and by the time this requirement was repealed in 1870, about 90% of railroad track in Canada was provincial gauge because railroad companies wanted that sweet, sweet government money. Within a decade, almost all of it had been converted to standard gauge, which was a major undertaking, but worth it because it enabled connectivity with other railroads, especially American railroads, which mostly used standard gauge, particularly in the Northeast bordering Canada. Municipalities wanted to be connected to the railroad network, as towns that weren't connected would be at a disadvantage, so many of them also offered to help pay to build railroads that would provide service to their towns. Also, with only a few railroads operating up to that time, there wasn't a lot of competition, and none at all in towns that only had one railroad running through them, meaning that towns that were on just one rail line faced a monopoly. Potential investors might have wondered if there were perhaps too many railroads all being built at about the same time, many of them covering similar routes. The answer to that turned out to be a resounding yes. Even before the CVR's first section opened, concerns were raised that it somewhat duplicated the routes of both the Grand Trunk and Great Western Railroads. In 1883, it was taken over by the Ontario and Quebec Railway, a subsidiary of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The Ontario and Quebec also owned another of George Laidlaw's railroads, the Toronto Grey and Bruce, and the combination extended as far as Owen Sound, where CP had a steamship service.
CP offered passenger service on this line from Toronto to Owen Sound until 1970. There was a station here in Brampton, just a little bit south of where I'm standing. This station, built in 1902, replaced an earlier station at the same location. It still exists, but it's not here anymore. It was moved in 1981, disassembled several years later, and then around 2010 it was reassembled as part of a community center in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, near the Mount Pleasant GO station, which is on a rail line that crosses over this one at a diamond just a little bit north of here. You may be able to see in the distance behind me a railroad signal. That was actually still lit until sometime this past summer, and fittingly, it was red. This was the Orangeville Station on the Orangeville Brampton Railway. But in the 150-year story we're talking about, this is a relatively recent addition. The original CP Orangeville Station was built here in 1907. In 1989, when it was no longer needed as a railroad station, it was relocated elsewhere in town and repurposed. But that station was not built on the Credit Valley Railroad. Remember, I had mentioned that CP bought not just the Credit Valley, but also the Toronto Grey and Bruce, both of which had service to Orangeville, and CP didn't need two rail lines into a small town. So they abandoned the CVR near here just a few years after it was originally built, and the original CP station in Orangeville was built on the TG&B line. While the original charter called for a line running northwest from Toronto to Orangeville, with a few branches off to the west at various points along the way, it was actually one of the westward branches that proved to be the most successful. The line leading to Woodstock is now a main line for CPKC, the company that resulted from the 2023 merger of Kansas City Southern and Canadian Pacific. The Milton GO line also uses that line. Beyond Woodstock, from there to St. Thomas, since 2009, that's been operated as a short line by a company called the Ontario Southland Railway. That sort of thing's been very common in the last several decades. The big railroads want to run big, long trains, long distances, and they're not so interested in the little stuff that doesn't make a lot of profit, like short branch lines or picking up and dropping off individual cars at customers along the way. So a whole bunch of short line railroads have popped up to handle that business and then interchange it with the big mainline railroads at freight yards where the two lines meet. The rest of the Credit Valley Railroad hasn't done so well. There was a branch off to Elora that came off the main line here at Cataract. By the time CP abandoned that in 1987, it was handling fewer than 20 cars a year. Like so many other railroads that have been abandoned, that's been turned into a rail trail. It's called the Elora Cataract Trailway. No points for guessing what two places it connects, and if you can hear running water in the background, you can probably also guess how Cataract got its name. In 1995, CP abandoned the former Toronto Grey and Bruce rail line from Orangeville north to Owen Sound, keeping this former Credit Valley Railroad line from Orangeville down to the junction with the CP main line at Streetsville in operation, but they plan to abandon this as well. In 2000, the town of Orangeville bought this line, creating the Orangeville Brampton Railway. The main purpose of doing that was to continue providing rail service to industry in Orangeville. The line also served a few industrial users in Brampton. And for about a decade and a half, there was an excursion train for passengers called the Credit Valley Explorer that ran along this line. Now, as I'm shooting this video, it's still a couple of weeks before the peak of fall color season, but even so, I think you can see why people would be interested in an excursion train on this line. Orangeville owned the line, but the operations were contracted out. In 2018, the contractor announced that they would be ending operations, and the passenger cars for the excursion train were sold to the Waterloo Central Railway. Later in 2018, a new contractor was found to operate the line. However, traffic on the line dropped to the point where it was no longer viable. The last train ran in December 2021, bringing to a close over 140 years of trains running on this rail line. In 2022, the local municipal governments bought the right-of-way, and there are intentions to turn at least part of it into a rail trail. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.